In the past fortnight, we've done a series of interviews on methamphetamine. Last week, Hayley spoke to two women who described being addicted to P and the process of getting off it. We spoke to the Police Association and to an academic who can measure meth usage by studying our wastewater. And yesterday, we spoke to the head of organised crime in New Zealand, the Organised Crime Unit, who told us about the increasingly violent competition between rival gangs for a bigger share of the meth pie, estimated to be worth roughly $600 million a year in untaxed cash. A recurring theme has been the arrival from Australia of new players in the meth business, often expat Kiwis deported to New Zealand after serving jail time across the Tasman. And one of the names we keep hearing over and over again is the Comancheros. To tell us a bit more about them, we're joined now live from Sydney via Skype by Dr. Michael Kennedy, who's not only a senior lecturer in policing at Western Sydney University, he was once also a detective in New South Wales working in crime intelligence and organised crime. Dr. Kennedy, we so appreciate you getting up early in New South Wales, Sydney, to join us across the Tasman. Thank you for your time and expertise.
Well.
Thank you. Tell us about the Comancheros. Who are we dealing with here?
Well, I'd warn you to be not give them too much credit for too many things. They're an outlaw motorcycle gang that probably evolved in the late 70s, early 80s. My memory of them is an incident called the Viking Hotel matter over here, where there was a shootout between the Comancheros and the Bandidos, where the Bandito bike group broke away. But they're one of a number of organised crime groups in Australia, which is really based on the federal model, if you like, whereas New Zealand has got a national model. So each state has its own branch. Even some cities have separate branches of these groups of bikies or one percenters or however you want to call them. And they're autonomous, whereas in New Zealand, I doubt they're going to have the same level of autonomy. And the other advantage for New Zealand is that the national police won't have to compete with each other in each state.
Yeah, with the federal police. Can I interrupt you and talk about that autonomy? So a small number of Comancheros have been deported from Australia back to New Zealand with high aspirations, and obviously the meth business here is huge. The money is huge. But there are incumbents, and the incumbent gangs are not at all keen to share their turf, right? So what will be the reaction of the headhunters, Black Power, the Mongrel Mob, etc., to predations from the Comancheros over their meth business? If they have a meth business, of course.
Well, I think you can create a problem that doesn't exist if you spend too much time on it. There's a limited market. I need to remind you that methamphetamine has been around since World War II, where they fed it by the bucketful to the bomber pilots and the tank drivers in World War II to the military. So it's not a new drug. Truck drivers used it all the time in Australia for long distance haulage. The crystal meth version of it is stronger. But it's the same outcome as if you use too much of it, you get paranoid, you get aggressive. It's an anti-fatigue drug in its purest sense. I think the market in New Zealand is always going to be limited. I think if the Comancheros think that they're going to go over there and bounce the Mongrel Mob around, they're in for a bit of a shock. And I think traditionally in Australia, the Pacific Island Maori community, because that's how we see it here, has always been fairly big in the security area, licensed clubs or even unlicensed clubs. They're sort of the tough guys around. And within the Comancheros, there was a high percentage of Arabic-speaking people, or people from the Middle East, Mediterranean area. So you had a lot of Maltese, Italians, Greeks, sort of Lebanese, all mixed in together. But even to start using their nationality as a focus point, it would be a big mistake. Their number one obligation is to their group, and not all within the group want to deal in drugs. A lot of them are they're keen on bodybuilding. It's a new image. Their focus is on riding around on motorbikes, and then they go back to funding through methamphetamine and not just methamphetamine, Indian hemp. New Zealand has always been pretty prolific in Australia because some of the best cooks of methamphetamine have come from New Zealand. Don't ask me why, but I think it was part of the home bake industry that existed in New Zealand.
Absolutely, which we remember from our youth. Not personally, I hasten to add. Yeah. So how do you police these buggers? Because we are seeing an increase in gang-on-gang violence in New Zealand. And it does look like turf wars. It may not be, but that's what it looks like. I'm not enough of an expert to say, but we had the head of organised crime with New Zealand Police on the show yesterday who was saying this is turf wars. How would you recommend, both as an academic now who teaches policing and as a former cop yourself, we deal with the new arrivals, the guys who've been deported across the Tasman and who are trying to set up shop here?
Well, I think the New Zealanders have always dealt with this differently to the Australians. And I think they've dealt with it better, to be quite frank. Free publicity to these groups is, to them, it's an advantage, it's not a disadvantage. So to give them free publicity, to maintain they're bigger than what they are, to give them a status that they don't deserve. Remember, they call themselves one percenters. Well, OK, let them be one percenters, you know, and I think to be strategic is to do with a competitive level amongst them. Remember, amongst these groups, they have a vested interest in making sure that their competition is kept out of the way. If you think for a minute that these groups don't inform to the police and don't give information in terms of their competition, well, they do. They do. They will. They deal. It's just a business. And I think the problem can be that when you deal with these groups in terms of a moral panic and you try to create this common enemy for the public between politics and the media, you create another problem. And New Zealand police have always dealt with this better than the Australian police because they don't have this competition between commissioners for funding. They don't have the problem of a national police department holding back information on the state police. They don't have a problem with negotiating with their security agencies. In New Zealand, it's the National Police Department, and they've always dealt with these things in a more sophisticated and less sort of in-your-face way. And I think that's the way to deal with organised crime. It will rise and it will fall, and it'll always be there.
Dr. Michael Kennedy from Western Sydney University, where he teaches policing. He's a former cop. We so appreciate your time this morning. We so appreciate a sort of perspective on the Comancheros and your advice against moral panic and your sense that both the New Zealand police and the other New Zealand gangs will be able to deal with them.
No, surprisingly positive.